In 2023, New York City witnessed one of the most shocking and disturbing family scandals to date. The Reed siblings, Julian, Clara, and Sophie, were the focus of a chilling true crime that would haunt their community for years to come. Julian Reed, at just 20 years old, had already carved out a niche for himself in the tech industry. His success was marked by his flashy cars and finely tailored suits, which, coupled with his dark skin and sharp features, made him a standout figure. His charm and charisma made him the center of attention, but beneath this polished exterior lay a dark and twisted influence over his older sister, Clara, and his younger sister, Sophie. Clara Reed, aged 25, was Julian's older sister. Clara was established in her career as a successful interior designer. Her tall, curvaceous figure and captivating dark eyes made her strikingly beautiful and confident. Despite her professional independence, she was disturbingly submissive to Julian's control. Their relationship had always been unusually close, but no one outside the family comprehended the depth of their troubling bond. Sophie Reed, the youngest at 17, was still navigating high school with dreams of becoming a dancer. Her youthful beauty, long braids, and glowing brown skin contrasted sharply with the darker elements of her family life. Initially, she was unaware of the full extent of the disturbing dynamics between Julian and Clara, but this ignorance became increasingly difficult to maintain as she started to perceive unsettling changes in her interactions with Julian. It was an unremarkable day in the Reed household. Julian, Clara, and Sophie had lived together in a sleek apartment in Harlem for the past year. The family dynamic appeared to be one of closeness, the three siblings sharing their lives and routines. But what no one outside the apartment knew was that behind closed doors, their relationships had spiraled into something dangerous. Julian had always been protective of his sisters, but over the past few months, his behavior had become more possessive, crossing boundaries that no sibling relationship should. What started as casual touches, his hand on Clara's back, brushing against Sophie's arm, soon escalated into something far more sinister. One afternoon, after a casual lunch together, the air in the apartment grew thick with unspoken tension. Julian sat at the head of the dining table, watching his sisters intently. Clara was seated closest to him, wearing a form-fitting black dress, while Sophie sat across from her, wearing a simple yet flattering white blouse and jeans. They were eating, but there was an electric current running through the room that was impossible to ignore. Julian's eyes flicked between them, his thoughts clouded with desire. Beneath the table, unseen by Sophie, his hand slowly slid up Clara's leg, his fingers creeping under her dress. Clara tensed but didn't stop him. They had done this before. Julian's advances had become a silent routine. But today felt different. The presence of Sophie, who sat unaware only a few feet away, heightened the thrill for both of them. Sophie, oblivious, continued talking about her day, discussing her dance classes and her upcoming performance. But Julian's focus was elsewhere. His fingers traced the curve of Clara's thigh, inching higher. Clara glanced at him, her face betraying a mixture of guilt and excitement. She shifted in her seat, but she didn't push him away. The thrill of the moment, knowing that Sophie could discover their secret at any moment, was too powerful for Julian to resist. His hand reached the edge of Clara's underwear, his fingers grazing the soft fabric. Clara's breath hitched, her fork slipping from her hand and clattering onto her plate. Sophie paused mid-sentence, looking up. "Are you okay?" Clara forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, I just dropped something." Sophie returned to her conversation, unaware of the silent battle taking place beneath the table. Julian's hand lingered on Clara's thigh for a moment longer before she finally pulled it away, excusing herself to the bathroom. Sophie barely noticed, engrossed in her phone, but Julian's mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. The game was getting more dangerous, but the risk only fueled his desire. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Julian cornered Clara in the kitchen. She was standing at the sink, washing the dishes, her back turned to him. The faint sound of running water filled the room, but the tension between them was palpable. Without warning, Julian moved behind her, placing his hands on her hips. "We can't keep doing this," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as Julian's hands slid up her waist. "You don't want me to stop, Julian murmured, his breath hot against her neck as his lips grazed her skin. Clara gripped the edge of the sink, her mind battling the overwhelming desire that flooded her senses. She knew it was wrong. Everything about their relationship was wrong. But she couldn't deny the pull Julian had over her. His hands moved higher, pushing the hem of her dress up as his lips trailed down her neck. "Julian, stop," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Julian ignored her weak protest, pressing his body against hers as his hands roamed over her curves. Clara closed her eyes, biting her lip as his touch sent shivers down her spine. The forbidden nature of their relationship only made it more intoxicating. But just as the moment reached its peak, Clara twisted away, her face flushed with shame. "We can't," she hissed, her voice more forceful this time. "It's wrong." Julian stared at her, his eyes dark with desire, but he didn't argue. He watched as she stormed out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The next day, the tension between Julian and Sophie began to shift. It was a hot summer afternoon, and the apartment was quiet. Clara was out running errands, leaving Julian and Sophie alone. They sat together in the living room, the silence between them charged with unspoken energy. Without warning, Julian leaned over, his hand brushing against Sophie's leg. She looked up, surprised, but didn't pull away. Emboldened by her silence, Julian's hand traveled higher, his fingers tracing the inside of her thigh. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as his touch grew bolder. "Julian, what are you doing?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just relax," he murmured, his lips brushing against her neck. Sophie trembled, unsure of what to do. Julian's hands were all over her, his touch invasive but gentle, his breath hot against her skin. She knew this was wrong, knew that what they were doing was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But she didn't stop him. The thrill of it all, the danger, was too overwhelming. Julian's lips trailed down her neck, kissing a slow path to her collarbone. Sophie's heart raced, her body betraying her mind as she leaned into him. But just as quickly as it had started, it ended. Sophie pulled away, her face flushed, her hands shaking. I need to go," she stammered, rushing out of the room, leaving Julian sitting alone in the darkened living room. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed around him, but he wasn't ready to stop just yet. As fall crept into New York City in late 2023, the once tight-knit bond between the Reed siblings began to splinter. Julian's secret life, now deeply entangled with both of his sisters, continued its dark descent into a world where lines were blurred beyond recognition. While Clara and Sophie remained unaware of each other's relationship with Julian, the dangerous games he was playing were becoming more difficult to control. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the sleek, modern kitchen. Julian stood by the stove, flipping pancakes, acting as if nothing had changed between him and his sisters. But under the surface, things were far from normal. Clara entered the room, wearing a tight t-shirt and shorts, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked exhausted, the weight of her hidden affair with her brother weighing on her. "Morning," she muttered, not meeting Julian's gaze as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he replied, his voice unnervingly calm. The quiet exchange between them was punctuated by the soft sizzle of pancakes in the pan. They ate breakfast in silence, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Under the table, Julian's foot nudged Clara's, a silent reminder of their secret. She stiffened but didn't pull away, her eyes darting toward Sophie, who was sitting across from her, oblivious to what was happening just a few inches away. As they continued eating, Julian's hand slowly slid beneath the table, his fingers brushing against Clara's bare thigh. Her breath caught in her throat, and she shot him a warning look, but he didn't stop. Instead, his hand traveled higher, grazing the hem of her shorts. Clara swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as his fingers teased her skin. She shifted in her seat, trying to resist the growing heat between her legs. Sophie continued to chatter about her day, completely unaware of the silent battle taking place across from her. But the thrill of it, the danger of being caught, made Julian's touch even more intoxicating. His hands slipped under Clara's shorts, fingers pressing against her underwear. She bit her lip, struggling to maintain her composure, but it was no use. The sensation was too overwhelming. Suddenly, Clara jumped up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to go to the bathroom," she blurted out, practically running from the room. Sophie looked after her, confused. "What's up with her?" "Nothing," Julian said, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "She's just not feeling well." Later that afternoon, when the apartment was quiet and Sophie had gone out to meet a friend, Julian found Clara in the kitchen again, cleaning up from breakfast. She didn't look at him as he entered, her back turned as she scrubbed the dishes in the sink. He approached her slowly, his eyes trailing down the curve of her back to the hem of her shorts. Without saying a word, Julian pressed himself against her from behind, his hands sliding around her waist and pulling her close. Clara froze, her hands still submerged in soapy water, but she didn't push him away. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we need to stop this." "We will," he murmured, his lips brushing against the back of her neck. "Just not yet." His hands traveled down her hips, fingers slipping under the waistband of her shorts. Clara's breath hitched as he tugged them down, his lips now trailing kisses along her neck and shoulders. She gripped the edge of the sink, her mind racing. She knew this was wrong, knew they were crossing a line they could never return from, but her body refused to listen. The forbidden nature of their relationship only made it more exhilarating. Julian's hands moved lower, exploring her body with a familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. Clara's eyes fluttered shut, her body betraying her as she leaned back against him. His fingers teased her, and she let out a soft moan, her breath ragged. But just as the moment reached its peak, Clara pulled away, her face flushed with shame. "This can't keep happening," she hissed, turning to face him. "It's too dangerous." Julian's eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he smirked, stepping back and letting her go. Clara hurried out of the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire. As the weeks passed, Julian's twisted relationship with his sisters continued to spiral. Clara tried to distance herself from him, but the pull of their secret affair was too strong. Meanwhile, Sophie remained oblivious to what was happening, caught in her own tangled web of emotions. One evening after dinner, Sophie sat on the couch watching TV, her legs curled up beneath her. Julian sat next to her, his arm casually draped over the back of the couch. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the television in the background. Without warning, Julian's hand slid down, resting on Sophie's thigh. She glanced at him, surprised, but didn't pull away. His hand lingered there for a moment, his fingers lightly tracing circles on her skin. Sophie's heart raced, but she said nothing, unsure of what to do. Julian's hand moved higher, creeping up her leg until it was dangerously close to the edge of her shorts. Sophie swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew this was wrong, knew that Julian shouldn't be touching her like this, but she didn't stop him. The thrill of it, the danger, was too overwhelming. His hand slipped under the fabric of her shorts, fingers grazing her underwear. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her body betraying her as she leaned into his touch. Julian's fingers pressed against her, teasing her in a way that made her heart pound in her chest. But just as quickly as it had started, it ended. Sophie pulled away, her face flushed with shame. I have to go," she stammered, rushing to her bedroom and locking the door behind her. The tension between Julian and his sisters was growing unbearable. Clara continued to struggle with her feelings for him, torn between guilt and desire, while Sophie found herself increasingly drawn to him in ways she didn't understand. The tangled web of lies and deceit was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. One night, after a heated argument with Clara about their relationship, Julian found himself standing outside Sophie's bedroom door. His mind was clouded with frustration and desire, and before he knew it, he was knocking softly on her door. "Sophie?" he called, his voice low. "Can I come in?" There was a long pause before the door slowly creaked open. Sophie stood there, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but she didn't say a word as she stepped aside to let him in. Julian closed the door behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small lamp on her nightstand. Sophie stood in the middle of the room, looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Without thinking, Julian crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing against hers. Sophie froze for a moment, her mind racing, but then she kissed him back, her body responding to his in ways she couldn't control. Their kiss was desperate, fueled by months of tension and forbidden desire. Julian's hands roamed over her body, pulling her closer as they stumbled toward the bed. Sophie let out a soft moan as his lips trailed down her neck, his hands slipping under her shirt. The heat between them was undeniable. But just as things began to escalate, a knock on the door interrupted them. "Sophie!" Clara's voice called from the hallway. "Are you in there?" Panic surged through both of them as they pulled apart, their hearts racing. Julian hurriedly straightened his clothes while Sophie frantically tried to compose herself. "Yeah, I'm here." Sophie called back, her voice shaky. "I'll be out in a minute." The sound of Clara's footsteps retreating down the hall was the only thing that broke the tense silence in the room. Julian and Sophie exchanged a long, heated look before he finally turned and left, leaving Sophie standing alone in the middle of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. The tangled web of their lives was unraveling faster than any of them could control, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around them. Winter had begun to settle in New York by the time the cracks in the Reed family secret could no longer be papered over. The tension, desire, guilt, and lies had festered for months, growing too large to contain. Their once tightly woven world was unraveling fast, and neither Julian nor his sisters could stop it. It was a cold December evening when it all came crashing down. Julian sat in the living room, the warm glow from the fireplace doing nothing to ease the bitter cold inside him. His mind was a mess of conflicting emotions: lust, guilt, and a sinking dread that the end was near. Clara, as usual, was in her room, avoiding him, while Sophie had taken to spending more time out of the apartment, distancing herself from the chaos Julian had created. But tonight, everything would come to an end. Clara had begun to grow suspicious. The weight of her secret relationship with Julian had become unbearable, but what gnawed at her most was the growing closeness between him and Sophie. She had noticed the lingering glances, the subtle touches when they thought she wasn't looking. Her jealousy, once manageable, now consumed her every thought. The moment came after dinner when Clara and Julian found themselves alone in the kitchen. Sophie had gone out for a supposed late-night run, but Clara's intuition told her something was off. She watched Julian move about the kitchen, washing dishes with a calmness that made her blood boil. "Where's Sophie?" Clara's voice was cold, accusing. Julian glanced at her, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "She went for a run." "Why?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Julian. I know something's going on between you two." His heart raced, but he didn't let it show. "Clara, you're being paranoid." "Paranoid?" she snapped, her voice rising. "I know what's happening. I see the way you look at her, the way you touch her when you think I'm not paying attention." Julian's jaw clenched. He could feel the walls closing in, the carefully crafted web of lies starting to fall apart. "Clara, stop. You're imagining things." But she wasn't. The truth was, Julian's affair with Sophie had escalated in recent weeks, and Clara's suspicions were more accurate than she realized. An hour later, Sophie returned home, her cheeks flushed from the cold, unaware of the storm brewing inside the apartment. She kicked off her shoes and headed straight for her room, but as she passed by the kitchen, Clara's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Sophie," Clara called, her voice strained, "we need to talk." Sophie froze, her stomach churning with anxiety. She could sense that something was wrong, but she couldn't have imagined just how wrong things were about to get. She slowly entered the kitchen, where Julian and Clara stood on opposite sides of the room, tension crackling in the air between them. "What's going on?" Sophie asked, her eyes darting nervously between her siblings. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Julian. "Why don't you tell her, Julian?" Tell her what you've been doing behind her back." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. What is she talking about? Julian's face darkened, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no escape now. Clara had seen too much, suspected too much. The only thing left to do was face the truth. "Clara," Julian began, but his words faltered under the weight of her glare. "Don't lie to her, Julian." Clara screamed, her voice cracking with the force of her emotions. "Tell her the truth, or I will." Sophie's confusion turned to panic as she stared at Julian, her breath quickening. "What's going on?" Clara's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "He's been screwing both of us, Sophie." The words hit Sophie like a freight train, knocking the air from her lungs. Her eyes widened in shock, disbelief washing over her as she turned to Julian, searching his face for a denial that never came. "You!" Sophie stammered, her voice barely audible. "You and Clara." Julian couldn't meet her gaze. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. The room spun as Sophie staggered back, her world crumbling around her. The betrayal was too much to comprehend. Her own brother, the man she had trusted, had been having an affair with both her and her sister. The weight of the truth pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. "How could you?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Julian stepped toward her, desperate to explain, but it was too late. The damage was done. The man she had once idolized was nothing more than a monster, a liar, and a manipulator. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he pleaded, reaching for her. But she recoiled as if his touch burned her skin. "Don't touch me," she screamed, backing away from him. "You're disgusting." Clara, fueled by her own jealousy and anger, wasn't done yet. "Tell her everything, Julian," she said, her voice venomous. "Tell her about the baby." Sophie's heart stopped. "What baby?" Clara's eyes flicked to Julian's, daring him to keep the secret any longer. "He got me pregnant, Sophie. That's why we need to stop this. I can't do this anymore." The room fell deathly silent as the gravity of Clara's words sunk in. Julian had not only betrayed them both, he had fathered a child with one of his sisters. Sophie's mind reeled, the betrayal cutting deeper than she could have ever imagined. Sophie had spent the past few days in a haze, consumed by rage and devastation. But now, that devastation had transformed into something cold and calculating. She knew what she had to do. They all had to pay. The night it all went down began like any other. They had gathered for dinner in the dimly lit apartment, sitting at the table like a family that had no idea how fractured it really was. The undercurrent of tension was thick, but no one spoke about it. No one dared to mention the lies hanging between them. Instead, they ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But for Sophie, the plan had already been set in motion. She had been careful, methodical. Her research on anesthetics had been meticulous, learning how much would be needed to render someone unconscious without immediately killing them. She had bought it quietly, using cash to ensure no trace would lead back to her. After dinner, as Clara and Julian settled in the living room to watch TV, Sophie made her move. She entered the kitchen under the guise of cleaning up and quietly retrieved the syringe she had hidden earlier. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, emotionless. This had to be done. There was no turning back. She approached the living room, where Julian sat on the couch, completely unaware of the danger lurking just behind him. In one swift motion, she plunged the syringe into the back of his neck. His body tensed for a moment, his eyes widening in confusion and panic, but within seconds, his muscles went limp. He slumped forward on the couch, unconscious. Clara, who had been sitting next to him, barely had time to react. She let out a shocked gasp, her hands trembling as she stood up, backing away from her sister. "Sophie, what the hell are you doing?" Clara cried, fear spreading across her face. But Sophie was already moving toward her, syringe in hand. Before Clara could escape, Sophie grabbed her arm, forcing her down onto the couch. Clara struggled, but the anesthetic was fast-acting, and within moments, she too was unconscious, slumping next to Julian. The apartment was quiet once again, except for Sophie's steady breathing as she stood over their unconscious bodies. Her mind was eerily calm, her emotions long gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. Now, the final part of her plan could begin. Sophie dragged Julian's limp body into the bathroom first, her strength fueled by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had prepared everything beforehand: the sharp knives, the plastic torp, the bleach. The sight of her brother lying unconscious on the cold bathroom floor didn't stir any feelings of guilt or hesitation within her. He was no longer her brother. He was the man who had manipulated her, deceived her, used her without a second thought. She began to cut into smaller and smaller pieces. She had planned every step, even practiced the movements in her mind, and now it was all coming together. As she finished with Julian, she felt nothing. No horror, no revulsion, just a numb sense of completion. Next, it was Clara's turn. Sophie dragged her sister into the kitchen. The irony was not lost on her. Clara had always been the heart of the family, the one who brought them together through the meals she lovingly prepared. Now, in this same kitchen, their lives were falling apart in the most unimaginable way. The apartment became a scene of chaos, but the details of that violence blurred in Sophie's mind. Her hands trembled, her clothes stained as the enormity of what she had done sank in. The weight of it pressed down on her, crushing her under the realization that there was no turning back. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. Amidst the silence of the now lifeless apartment, Sophie stood in shock. There was nothing left to save, no chance for redemption. What had started as a twisted secret had ended in devastation. And now, all she could do was wait for the consequences to arrive. The police arrived days later, prompted by worried neighbors who hadn't seen any of the Reed siblings for some time. What they found inside the apartment would shock even the most experienced detectives. The scene was one of devastation. Traces of a violent struggle, signs of a terrible tragedy that had unfolded behind closed doors. The blood-stained walls and the eerie silence of the apartment painted a grim picture of what had occurred. The brutality of the crime left the authorities speechless, its impact sure to linger in the minds of the city's residents for years to come. Sophie was found a few blocks away, wandering the streets in a daze, covered in dried blood. She didn't resist when the police arrested her. She didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The trial was swift, with the evidence overwhelmingly stacked against Sophie. Her defense argued that she had acted in a state of temporary insanity, driven to madness by the emotional manipulation and trauma inflicted on her by Julian and Clara. But the jury remained unconvinced. The crime had been too violent, too calculated, too heinous for them to show any leniency. Sophie Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her future forever marked by the bloodshed she had unleashed. In the quiet solitude of her prison cell, she would be left to relive the horrors of that night, the silence that followed, the cold detachment that had driven her to commit the unthinkable.